Good afternoon, everyone. Can we come to attention? And for those of you who don't know me, I'm John Metzler. I recently retired from the African Studies Center, but our three senior administrators in the African Studies Center are all en route to a conference in New Orleans. So they called me as a third stringer. But it is a pleasure, and I'm very happy because Betsy and I started our graduate program in different departments at UW-Madison more years ago than we'll say, but we've had classes together, so I've known Betsy for a good long time. So it is a real honor for me to be able to read what they've said about Betsy before, because I don't want to, I really want to get everything in here, because I think they've done a good job. Elizabeth Schmidt, Betsy, is Professor Emeritus at Loyola University in Maryland. She received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has written extensively about U.S. involvement in apartheid South Africa, women under colonialism in Zimbabwe, the nationalist movement in Guinea, and foreign intervention in Africa, from Cold War to the War on Terror. Her books include, and you can buy it back there, Foreign Intervention in Africa After the Cold War, Sovereignty, Responsibility, and the War on Terror. Foreign Intervention in Africa from Cold War to the War on Terror. Cold War and Decolonization in Guinea, 1946 to 1958. Mobilizing the Masses, Gender, Ethnicity, and Class in Nationalist Movements in Guinea, 1939 to 1958. Peasants, Traders, and Wives, Shona Women in the History of Zimbabwe, 1870 to 1939, and Decoding Corporate Camouflage in the U.S. Business Support for Apartheid South Africa. And she wrote that one before she was a graduate student, so we were all intimidated by Betsy because she came in with a bona fide publication before she started her PhD program. Her talk today is Foreign Intervention in Africa After the Cold War, the role of outsiders in the current crisis. And then in addition to foreign intervention, the bookstore also has one other of her books for sale back here, Cold War Decolonization in Guinea, 1946 to 1958. Betsy,
thank you very much.
Welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming. I know you all have a lot to do, and I had the pleasure of meeting many of you last night, which was really wonderful. MSU has been treating me royally, and I'm very excited about meeting with some of the graduate students this afternoon and doing a podcast with Peter Alegi later. So it's going to be a full and, for me, very exciting day. I teach at a university where there is not only no African Studies Center, but for decades I was the only Africanist on campus. And only in the last 6 years or so have I been joined by someone in the Modern Languages Department who teaches Francophone African literature as well as French language instruction. So she is allowed to teach one either French West African or French Caribbean literature class per semester. So it's a kind of lonely existence. And when I get out to a place like this and I see all the events and all the graduate students and all the faculty in the many departments and the art, in the African Studies Centers, I'm just thrilled. So this is very exciting for me. I should say, in terms of that long introduction, that I went to graduate school directly out of the anti-apartheid movement, hence my first book, Decoding Corporate Camouflage, U.S. Business Support for Apartheid, which I wrote shortly after I was an undergraduate studying American history, having no training in Africa, never thinking that I had a lot of nerve to undertake such a thing. But I worked with some very inspiring people who encouraged me. And then I went on an undercover trip to South Africa where I got in trouble with the security police, and the book was banned. And meanwhile, I knew that I wanted to keep working on Africa, and there was really no way to do that with a bachelor's in American history. And so I decided to go to graduate school to get my union card. And so my grades as an undergraduate were not sufficiently good or plentiful. I did a lot of things credit no entry in those days you could do at Oberlin College. And so they didn't even consider my GPA. But my book was my entree. That's what got me into graduate school and got me the support I needed to survive there. I didn't really take a traditional route into academia. I know a lot of people have done wonderful things through Peace Corps and other kinds of volunteer opportunities that get them involved, and that wasn't my particular route. So in any event, today I'm going to talk about my latest book, which is very different from much of the work that I did during the kind of intermediate years of my professional life. I did the traditional monographs where you go and you live in a country and you learn the language as best as you can, and you do archival work as a historian, and you interview people, and that was very, very exciting. And I had started out as a doctoral researcher in Zimbabwe, Anglophone Southern Africa, of course, because I couldn't go back to South Africa. And I was also planning to respect the cultural boycott had I been able to go in. So I went to Zimbabwe a few years after independence, and it was a very, very exciting time to be there. And then one thing led to another, where I wound up also going to Guinea and living and doing research, and that resulted in my books on the nationalist movement. But in later years, after I'd been teaching for many years, I was inspired to write the last two books. So this one, Foreign Intervention in Africa After the Cold War, and its predecessor, kind of companion volume, but not a part one, part two, that was really focused on foreign intervention in Africa during the periods of decolonization in the Cold War. And those books have case studies from across the continent, although they don't, strive to cover everything in every conflict. But they're different from my earlier books in that they're not based on my own primary research. And they are intended for non-specialist audiences. They're not intended for other scholars of Southern Africa or other scholars of Francophone West Africa, but rather my hope is for undergraduate and graduate students who may be studying any given area in Africa or the world, or conflict, peace and justice, maybe people not studying Africa in particular. Also, my hope is to reach the media and maybe some Foreign Service officers and maybe some congressional aides who can sort of provoke their bosses into paying attention and doing the right thing. NGO staffers, right? So I do not purport to be an expert in any of the countries where I did case studies. But these books took me a long time to write. I didn't realize how challenging it would be to write these kinds of syntheses, because each chapter you have to sort of become a mini expert and get it right. And that means you have to know who to read, you have to know what the debates are, how to weigh the evidence, and just immerse yourself in each case study, as well as sort of developing the framework. And so here I am, a historian of late colonial Africa, starting in Anglophone Southern Africa, moving to Guinea, and now writing about very current things, very current conflicts going on in various parts of Africa, and determined to show the historical roots of these conflicts, because again, not only do our leaders in this country fail to read much of anything, they don't know history. And as a historian, I'm very aware of how important that is to understanding current situations. And of course, you all know that. So I'm preaching to the choir in that regard. But I just wanted to explain why these books, and also to indicate, if you do happen to pick it up, and I love it, when people read my book, I'm really thrilled, and I don't mean to take business away from Amber's bookstore, but if you don't have the money to buy the book, I'm not dependent on your money to live, and go to the library, share a copy, do as they did in the African nationalist movements, they'd share the newspaper. And I have flyers, so if you want to think about it, there's flyers back there you can take home and just think about, okay, do I want to read this or not? the goal then is to reach people who aren't specialists. So I don't have lots and lots of footnotes, which as a historian makes me very, very uncomfortable. In this book, for instance, half of the text is my footnotes and bibliography. I mean, half of that book, right? That archival documents out the wazoo. One is not a sufficient in a footnote. You want to show that there were 10 sources that say this before I dare to make the claim. That's very much a part of my training. You know, you cite everything. And so here I was told, no, you know, you can cite direct quotations, but apart from that, no. You know, you don't want to clutter the text. So what I was advised to do, and I was very happy to do, not on this book, but the predecessor, and then I sort of copied the model, is at the end of each chapter, I have a little suggested reading essay where I pick out the kind of key sources that I used and talk a little bit about each one and what you can hope to get from it so that you don't just get faced with the bibliography. And then I tried to cite sources that would be readily accessible to readers in this country. So lots of things you can get online, download as PDFs or websites you can go to. So realizing that not everybody has access to university databases to go to JSTOR and et cetera. But I do cite those articles too. A lot of things that are published by think tanks, you can download the PDFs for free. But it also means that I'm focusing primarily on sources in English, some in French, but I don't cite Arabic sources and things like that. But obviously the sources I do cite such sources. So if you're delving deeper, once you go to those things. So if you're thinking of teaching, those of you who are graduate students, or you're getting on the job market or whatever, these are the kinds of books that hopefully, you will interest you in teaching survey courses and that kind of thing. So I was motivated by my own students. So my own students at Loyola University, Maryland, often come to my classes without having had any background in African studies. And again, you may experience that as well. And so they also come with a lot of preconceptions and misconceptions, right, that they get from the media and even mainstream media that really ought to know better. I mean, the sort of tropes that are constantly trotted out to explain conflict in Africa, tribalism, religion, without any kind of understanding of colonial roots and outsider involvement. So the motivation was to take some of these popular myths and bust them. And so, when we hear about Africa, I have my students brainstorm at the beginning of the semester, and of course they bring up, war, conflict, tribalism, disease, disaster, poverty, and so usually not much positive or other than, maybe the white savior conflict and we're going to go and save them from all that. And my students are predominantly white, so it really is a white savior complex. So my goal was to look at the roots of some of these predicaments and the role that outsiders have played without absolving all African actors of any responsibility, right? That there are warlords, there are autocrats, there are violent extremist organizations that are definitely embroiled in these things and are, creating problems. But most of my students, and I would say most Americans, if they're aware of Africa at all, are not aware of the role that Western powers have played, whether it be the former colonial powers or the former Cold War superpowers, increasingly actors from the global South, from the Gulf, from all parts of the world, and having interests in Africa that many outsiders don't understand. So both of these books, the one on the Cold War and then this book, are hoping to undermine these myths. And I decided that I wanted, especially in this book, to bring together case studies from across the continent to show that it's not just in the Horn of Africa, or it's not just in the Western Sahel, but there are patterns and trends of outsider involvement motivated by very similar things with very similar kinds of outcomes to the intervention. And so I have case studies from East, West, Central, and North Africa. North Africa is part of the continent, and I'm insistent about that. And so that focus is not as great, but I do look at the Arab Spring in North Africa, so looking at Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, and the ramifications not only in North Africa, but also how that spilled over into the conflicts of the Western Sahel or into the Horn of Africa. And that Sahara Desert is not an impenetrable barrier, right? So I have chapters 4 to 11 are all case studies. Most chapters have only a single case study, but a couple of them have 2 case studies that are very much related. Now, in the first of the foreign intervention books, I looked at the motivation for foreign intervention. It was during the periods of decolonization and the Cold War, and generally the motivation was the communist threat. And as I'm sure you all know, the communist threat was often a trumped-up charge. It was a catch-all for anything that somehow was contrary to the interests primarily of Western powers. I mean, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China and Cuba were far, far less involved in the interventions than the other countries. And so the West generally perceived anything that threatened the status quo to be radical nationalism, and radical nationalism was quickly interpreted as communism, whether or not it was. And the movements that engaged in trying to make fundamental social, economic, and political change, a departure from the colonial era, catering to the interests of the general population rather than to outside powers, they were perceived as communists. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Congo and the Congo Crisis and how Patrice Lumumba was viewed as a communist when in fact he was a radical nationalist through and through, and had sought aid first from the West before he was spurned and then went to the Soviet Union. And most of the aid he got from the Soviet Union was through the UN, right? That it wasn't a unilateral operation, but he was viewed with suspicion to the extent that the US and Belgium were determined to have him assassinated. So after the Cold War, the paradigms, the justifications for foreign intervention changed. One thing that's also significantly different is that many of them are multinational interventions. It's not the French intervening here, although they do their share of that, or the United States, but it's international organizations like the United Nations or sub-regional organizations like the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, or a similar organization in East Africa. So there are these regional bodies that have gotten involved in trying to broker peace accords, to monitor peace accords, or to intervene militarily to stop conflicts. And so multinational intervention is much larger a factor since the 1990s. And also African involvement in other African countries. So these sub-regional African bodies as well as the African Union. So that's a change. And then the rationales are different. And so looking at all these case studies, looking at all the evidence, I tried to figure out, what are the sort of main reasons that are cited. And the first one that's cited is response to instability. And the corollary of that is the responsibility to protect civilian lives. And that's something relatively new. Although it certainly could have been justified by the UN Charter earlier, it's something that really emerged due to the lack of response to the genocide and ethnic cleansing in the Balkans, in Bosnia, and the failure of the international community to respond, and the similar failure to respond in Rwanda. And the ability to sort of violate the principle of international sovereignty, which has been around since the 17th century, was made possible by the increasing number of conventions that have been signed since World War II, since the aftermath of the Holocaust, that were increasingly giving the international community a greater voice in the affairs of nation states. And finally, the 2005 General Assembly resolution that said if a sovereign state fails to protect its civilian population, either willfully or because of incapacity to do so, then it is all right. It is the right of the international community, and it is the obligation of the international community to intervene to stop genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And so that gave room to the international community to act if it so chose. So sometimes it will say we are responding because of the R2P, the responsibility to protect resolution, to protect civilian lives. But as I argue later, that happens very selectively, right? In some cases, yes, some cases, no. Why? Well, because of the interests of the intervening powers, or the lack of interest. So that's the first reason. The second is the war on terror. And the war on terror, I write it like that, is very much like the communist threat, the sort of boogeyman that becomes a catch-all to intervene against any kind of activity that those in power find contrary to their interests. And certainly there are violent extremists that are doing horrific things to local civilian populations. There's no question about that. But they are often, let me put it this way, there are other insurgency movements that are against the governments in nation states that are the result of local grievances that have nothing to do with any kind of international terrorist network. They are often legitimate grievances by populations that have been neglected or abused by their often non-elected government, or a government that caters only to certain groups in certain regions or certain socioeconomic classes or certain ethnic groups. And there are people who are desperate and looking for solutions and find no path open to getting them. And so they begin insurgencies. And it's only then that violent extremists have sometimes taken advantage of these groups that are already organizing around local issues. And so the roots of the problem are not some kind of radical Islam, but the underlying problems. And they're not going to be resolved until those problems are addressed and resolved. And usually the war on terror operations with outside intervention don't recognize that, don't make any attempt to address them, work with the governments that are the abusers, arm and equip them and train them to fight terrorism, and the problems are exacerbated. So there are these justifications, but I do say they're justifications, they're rationalizations. The reasons that countries intervene continue to be, for their own interests, and often the interests are strategic, geopolitical interests, concern about proximity to to violent extremist activities, strategic places like the Horn of Africa, and the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, where most of the Middle Eastern oil is coming both to the United States and also to China now. Or they are countries where there are important resources like oil, natural gas, uranium, or various kinds of strategic minerals. And the Congo, of course, would be a main source of all kinds of minerals that we use in our advanced technology, et cetera. So if there's instability there, there's a motivation for outsiders to intervene to try to bring back peace and a good business environment. If there's one in Rwanda, as we saw, there's not a lot of motivation to get involved, unless it's the French who are trying to shore up the regime that actually was responsible for the genocide, because they are intent on keeping strength in Francophone Africa, and the rebels were viewed as being Anglophone proxies from Uganda, right? So that gets a little bit into the case studies. So regardless of the official rationale, the intervention has remained selective. And also, rather than promoting peace and stability, I conclude, foreign military intervention has more often increased outside support for repressive regimes, exacerbated local conflicts, and undermined prospects for regional peace. So it's generally been counterproductive. So my book then begins with, well, what is behind these conflicts, right? So poverty, corruption, and violent conflicts are indeed present in many African countries, but they're rooted in political and economic practices that date back to the colonial era. They date back to the Cold War era and alliances that were formed at that time, and attempts by outsiders to influence the political and economic systems during the periods of decolonization and the post-independence periods. So in the beginning of the book, I lay out these sort of claims, what the myths are, what the problems are, the motivations for intervention, and then I talk about the case studies that I look at. I also talk about what I don't look at in the book, and I'm sure you're all waiting for the Q&A when you're going to ask me the questions that I haven't yet brought up. And so I'll just tell you that I cover a little bit in the first chapter of the things that are critical to understand about Africa, but will not be the focus of this book. Already the publisher was, oh my gosh, your book is way over, can you cut it now? It was on its way to the copy editor, and I said, no, it's too late. Hence the small print. They actually let me get away with it, but don't count on that with a publisher. They were very nice to me. But I am focusing on political and military intervention. Economic intervention is crucial. It's critical to understand that. And so I do have a little section in the first chapter where I talk about the economic intervention during the periods of decolonization in the Cold War that have been devastating for Africa, and which lay the groundwork for the political problems that ensued in the aftermath of the Cold War. So this is, in a nutshell. Again, I'm sure you're all familiar with the neoliberal framework of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the Washington Consensus, named for the hub of those two organizations and the capital of the United States, which of course prescribes so-called free market economic solutions where the government needs to get out of the economy. And of course what this meant is ending food subsidies, ending protective tariffs, ending subsidies for health care, free education, and the sacking of many civil servants in areas that we don't even, well, we might think of, but the average American does not think, oh, that's a government job, like being a doctor, being a nurse, being a midwife, let alone the school teachers, not only K through 12 as we have, but on up through university. These are all civil servants. And so when the government needs to get out of the economy, a lot of people lose their jobs. When the protective tariffs are lifted, a lot of African industries go under. When subsidies end, people can't buy food. And so the only way to do this and to get loans from the World Bank and the IMF and private banks in the West is to anger a lot of people. And so, those people who are losing their jobs and those people who are desperate to survive and are facing inflation and food shortages and import shortages, they want to go out and protest in the streets. And so the only way to keep this going is to keep a lid on civil society and to be repressive. And so we, through our economic prescriptions, wound up paving the way for really repressive governments that we then supported during the Cold War. Again, you all know this. And at the end of the Cold War, we didn't need them anymore, right? We don't need those regional policemen. So we're gonna cut aid and economic and military aid to these human rights abusers in Africa. So we cut off Somalia, we cut off Sudan, we cut off the Congo, or Zaire it was called then. And so they are now vulnerable to the pro-democracy movements, which is not a bad thing, but they're also vulnerable to all kinds of rebel forces and insurgencies that may be intent on setting up a similar system, but with themselves in charge instead of the previous dictator. So the warlords appear. And so So I do talk about this as laying the groundwork for the crises of the 1990s. I mentioned climate change as something that is critical to understand in terms of what's going on in these African conflicts, but will not be the focus of this book. So I give a little bit of an introduction about the northern hemisphere producing the greenhouse gases that are causing the oceans to warm, the sea levels to rise, the rain to fall over the ocean rather than the land, resulting in the droughts, the oceans to flood the coastal areas, causing the flooding, and these sort of seemingly contradictory droughts and floods that are afflicting much of the global south. And mention some of the conflicts where this is really a factor that often doesn't come out in the media, right? That you don't hear about the drying up of Lake Chad that has devastated the fishing industry and the agriculture in northeastern Nigeria, in Niger, in Cameroon. And you think, oh, northeastern Nigeria, isn't that where Boko Haram is? Is there any relationship? Yeah, there's a relationship. I mean, these are people without education, without resources, without prospects for employment, young men who have no way to make a living and no way to have the resources to marry and have children and therefore to become a social adult in their society. And here comes a violent extremistic group, and I go into the history of how a group that wasn't initially violent became violent due to government repression. But here comes a violent extremist group that says, okay, well, maybe you can have respect as a married man and farmer or fisherman in this society, but you can have fear and you can get women, right? And so Boko Haram starts to take root amongst desperate people. Similarly, we hear about those pirates, attacking oil tankers off the coast of Somalia. Well, do we realize that those pirates used to be fishermen, and the international fishing industry, especially from East Asia, came and fished out their waters, and they had no employment. And so they started using their little fishing skiffs to go out and attack the international trawlers and hold people for ransom. And when they left, well, we could go after the oil tankers. We could get some good ransom money there. And the same in the Niger Delta. In that case, it was the pollution of the oil companies destroying the agricultural and fishing industries in the Niger Delta. And hence we have people illegally tapping oil pipelines, and we hear about the pipelines that blow up and kill all the villagers, and we hear about the increased piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. And again, these are desperate people whose livelihoods have been destroyed either by outsiders coming in and taking their resources, by toxic waste dumping, by taking out all the timber resources and the erosion that results from that, or pollution, or the greenhouse gases that create the climate change. So I mention some of these things in the case studies, but I don't delve into it as a major focus. So there are various other things. China, everyone wants to know, okay, well, what about China? Well, yeah, China's involved, and it's certainly doing some things that are damaging to Africa, and in many ways no different from what Western countries did during the colonial period, the scramble for resources, and then markets for their cheap goods, and labor to build some of these projects. But they are different in other ways in that they often bring their own workforce, right? So that Africans often don't even get jobs, or if they get jobs, they're not the ones that will bring a skill to them that they can then use after the Chinese leave, but rather the unskilled jobs in unsafe mines, all kinds of health repercussions. So that's problematic, but the Chinese goods, like the Western goods, undermine African industries. And so that's been a problem. But Chinese intervention has been much more economic than anything else up until now, and they are beginning to get more involved militarily. So since this book is focusing mostly on political and military intervention, It doesn't cover China to a great extent, but in the later chapters, yes, China is now sending armed peacekeepers to the UN forces, sending a whole battalion of Chinese to a peacekeeping mission, building a base in Djibouti like the Western and Gulf powers to protect its interests in the transit of the oil through the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. And also to protect its own people who are now scattered around the continent. So that's definitely something to watch, but it's not the focus of the book. Okay. So what I would like to do is try to remember to move my clicker, so you're all familiar with Africa and yeah, So what I did, again, for the undergraduate students who might not have learned anything about Africa before, is to have a couple maps in the beginning, this one, and then I have a map of North Africa and Central Asia. I think that's the second map, because I do spend some time in the early part of the book laying out the history of some of the violent extremist organizations that are now in Africa, and go back to the Cold War period where the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan were recruiting Muslims from around the world to go and fight the atheist, godless communists, the Soviets who had been occupying Afghanistan from 78 to 88. And so we recruited those people, again, you probably know this, who became the sort of fathers of Al-Qaeda, who became the grandfathers of many of the movements that then emerged in Western Europe, North Africa, and the Western Sahel and the Horn of Africa. And then that, of course, spawned the Islamic State in Iraq. So I go back to that period to say, guess who the origin of these violent extremist organizations is? They didn't come out of nowhere. They didn't get this training and this money and these weapons out of nowhere. They got them from the West, and they got, with money from Saudi Arabia and trainers in Pakistan as well. So I go back to that period. So I want students to see where those countries are situated compared to those in Africa that later feel the ramifications. And I also, I'm backtracking, but I also spend time in the early chapters talking about myths relating to Islam, because I think that is so important to understand the conflation the media has of Islamic fundamentalism, which is a religious perspective, not all that different from Christian fundamentalism, which is where the whole idea emerged, being true to the original, true as they can to the original work, and resisting political, economic, and social changes that are somehow threatening to them, and that's what provokes this sort of return to fundamentalism. Islamists who believe that their religion should guide every aspect of their lives, their social life, their economic life, their political life, their religious life, and some of whom participate in democratic processes. They're moderates, they form political parties, they organize wonderfully, they're very powerful and therefore very threatening to some autocratic regimes, but they participate in the democratic process. The radicals who say, let's do this from the top down, we're not going to participate in this, or we're going to get power and then keep power. And then there are violent extremists who sometimes have emerged from these groups and sometimes have emerged in the prisons of Western Europe, where the children of immigrants who had no prospects wound up becoming petty thieves and being incarcerated in French prisons and Belgian prisons, and they get radicalized by self-taught clerics, in the prisons, who appoint themselves as authorities who are not recognized by most Muslims in the world, and certainly not by religious scholars and religious leaders. And so I go through all these terms that get conflated: Islamic terrorists, Islamists, when they're really talking about violent extremists rather than people who have these religious principles. And so I talk about the terms, how they should be distinguished, and which ones I will not use and which ones I will use in the book. And then there's a glossary and things like that. So I do have maps that will then show these things. So The first case study that I'll talk about just briefly, just to give you an idea of how these are set up, is of Somalia. And I do go back a little bit and look at the Cold War roots of the problems that began to emerge in the 1990s. So during the Cold War, as I'm sure many of you know, Somalia was an ally first of the Soviet Union and then of the United States. And Ethiopia was an ally first of the United States in the West and then of the Soviet Union. So there was a flip. And they switched sides. And I go into that in more detail in the earlier book that focuses on the Cold War, why that happened. But the upshot of it is that in Somalia, which is the case study in this book, the dictator, Mohammed Said Barre, was very clever in playing on superpower rivalry and shifted his alliance fairly easily from the Soviet Union to the United States. He had done some fairly good things in his early years in terms of being an African socialist who focused on primary education, primary health care, rural development, but increasingly began to concentrate power in his hands, used clan divisions to bolster his power, encouraged rivalry between different clans, privileged certain clans, his clan, his mother's clan, his father's clan, and was intent on destroying any civil society institutions that he felt were a threat. He felt that Islamists were a threat. So there was a lot of repression against the Islamists, as well as other groups. And so at the end of the Cold War, when the United States and other Western powers discovered that he was abusing human rights and cut him off, there was a power vacuum. And so not only was there room for the pro-democracy movement to maneuver for the first time, but there was also a whole lot of room for clan-based warlords and their militias to begin to operate. And of course, they were much stronger than the pro-democracy movement that was not armed, right? So the warlords really began to wreak havoc, and Somalia was divided in many parts of the country into just little fiefdoms of these different warlords and their militias. And I guess the next thing I would move to would be still in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, when these militias were competing for power, there was a devastating famine. And this was something that happened periodically in the Horn, but of course now increasingly with climate change. So there was a famine that was induced by the war, but exacerbated by drought, and it was threatening the lives of many, many people in Somalia. And so, concerned about regional instability in 1992, first the United Nations, and then the United States decided that there ought to be some kind of humanitarian intervention to help the starving people. And the different militias and warlords were using food as a weapon of war, that they were monopolizing food for their own people, and especially for their own armed groups, and they were denying access to other people. And so the UN decided that there ought to be a military intervention to make sure that food got to the civilians who needed it. Now, interestingly, the UN rep on the ground in Somalia, Mohammed Sanoun, opposed the military intervention, and he was withdrawn because he opposed it. And he opposed it because there were a lot of local negotiations going on that he thought could bear fruit, and he wanted them to have the chance to do it. So he was withdrawn, and the UN decided on this military operation. The US decided to spearhead it, and so it headed this task force. And initially they were really just supposed to protect the convoys that were coming from the airport with the food. They were not allowed to forcibly disarm the warlords or their militias. So that was in late 92, but by the early 1993, or what would be our springtime in 93, there was a new mandate, and these are often conflated in writing about Somalia. The new mandate gave the UN enormous powers to forcibly disarm the warlord militias, to arrest them, to detain them, to really take a much more active military role. And again, this new mission was spearheaded by the US. And so as far as the people on the ground were concerned, you know, this was the same thing. This was the UN, this was the US, this was armed. But now the US and the UN have taken sides in a civil war because Boutros Ghali and the United States were determined that Mohammed Farah Aidid was not going to take power, and his rival Ali Mahdi would be, you know, the preferable warlord. And so what many Americans don't know, they do know about Black Hawk Down. They've seen the movie. They don't know anything about the conflict because the movie really didn't say much about the conflict. It was really about, you know, we don't leave our own behind, and this is what happened to us. And you know, it has its value, but it's also dangerous because it really doesn't at all explain why Somalis were angry at the United States. We've come to help, right? But no, we've come to take sides in a civil war, and the plane was shot down by the militia in the territory of Mohammed Farah Aidid, who was the one that we were countering in the civil war. The US-UN military intervention had killed lots of civilians, including elders who were convening to negotiate a peaceful end to the conflict. All kinds of things had happened right before these helicopters were shot down. And when they were shot down, they fell on civilians, including children. And, you know, horrible numbers of people were killed. And so even though they were shot down by the warlords and their militias, it was a US helicopter doing stuff that it had no business doing as far as those people were concerned. And so they attacked the survivors and those who came to rescue them and dragged their bodies through the streets. And what Americans don't know is that, yes, 18 servicemen were killed, but more than 1,000 men, women, and Somali children were killed in retribution, you know, by those in power on the ground. And so the U.S. Under Clinton said, okay, you know, we didn't send Americans to actually die in military interventions. You know, we don't expect that to happen. So we're pulling out. And when the U.S. pulled out, the UN felt that it couldn't continue the operation. So they pulled out in '94. And this again gave way to another power vacuum. So, you know, we've done nothing to, you know, facilitate any of the nonviolent groups, the civil society organizations that were intent on building new institutions. We just pull out. And so in the 1990s, there's turmoil in Somalia. Warlords, Al-Qaeda begins to set up a base in East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya. They bomb the U.S. embassies there. And then, of course, September 2001, the attacks on the United States by Al-Qaeda. And suddenly the U.S. is interested in Somalia again. And so I'm not going to go into the detail of what happened, but there are a number of attempts by outsiders to set up a new government. Well, usually it was without much consultation with people on the ground, setting up governments that were not representative of the people, were not representative of the different clans, didn't even have enough support to set up operations in the capital city. And we're totally dependent on outside funders and outside militaries to stay in power. So one after another of these failures at governments were imposed. And then finally in 2006, in February, the CIA backed a new warlord coalition that teamed up with Ethiopia to try to crack down on the Islamist movement that was gaining strength in Somalia. And what the Islamists were doing, and these again were nonviolent at this point, Islamists, who were saying, okay, we don't have any social services here. We have no central government here. We're going to set up schools. We're going to set up healthcare. We're going to set up charities. we're going to set up some kind of law and order in these war zones where warlords are targeting civilians. So we'll set up Islamic courts. And the U.S. goes, Islamic courts, Sharia, oh my God, we've got to stop this. And so they start cracking down on these groups that were actually welcomed by many segments of Somali society. So even though the Somalis were mostly Sufi and more tolerant, they didn't mind these other groups that were somewhat different. They were providing much needed social services and nobody else was. And they were protecting from warlords and nobody else was. And one of the militias was a militia that guarded the Islamic courts. It was called Al-Shabaab. And it was a youth militia. It was young men, unemployed men who were guarding the courts from the warlords. Well, when the US and Ethiopia start going out after these Islamists, Al-Shabaab got radicalized. And those segments that were already there, that were already radical, said, see, this is what happens. We've got to get, anti-foreign backlash starts. Osama bin Laden, calls for jihad against the United States. People who were not from Somalia start to come to join this jihad in late 2006, including veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War. And some were already in Somalia, but some were coming from other countries. So you scratch the surface of any of these violent extremist organizations in Libya, in Algeria, there are veterans there of the Soviet-Afghan War, recruited by the US, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. So they come. Ethiopia invades in late 2006, early 2007. They're allowed to occupy the country, and they're driving Al-Shabaab down into the south. But Al-Shabaab maintained a lot of control. Finally, the African Union, the UN get involved. They rehat the Ethiopians as African Union troops, although they bring in the Burundians and they bring in Kenyans. Kenya has its own reasons for invading Somalia, and I'm not going to go into that either, but they actually had a unilateral intervention in 2011 that killed a large number of people, civilians in southern Somalia. Then the UN sort of retroactively recognized them and rehatted them as African Union. Well, again, the local people are going to say, well, that was African Union. Those are the same people who killed my family. And so they're not going to look kindly on this. And so, sometimes people will ask me each time, well, is it better to have intervention by African powers than, these Western troops? And I'll say, well, it could be, but it depends on which African powers are involved and what they're doing once they get there. And too often, the regional peacekeeping forces have involved parties that are neighboring countries with vested interests in a certain outcome that have nothing to do with the well-being of the local people. They might have, I'm not saying that they won't, but often they don't. I could skip to another case study just to make a brief reference, and that would be the ECOWAS intervention in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and were called ECOMOG, the ECOWAS monitoring group. And I was living in Guinea at the time of some of those conflicts, and the Ghanaian soldiers who participated were coming back with shiploads of consumer goods, electronics and refrigerators and stoves that they'd looted from fleeing civilians in these countries. And one of the reasons we knew about that was that we had friends who lived by the military camps, and electronic specialists were setting up little, we call them pop-up stores here, right? But they're the container stores in, the shipping containers. They have their little stores. And they were fixing electronic devices that the returning Ghanaian soldiers had, they plugged in their, Liberian devices with their 110 volts into the 220 voltages in Guinea. Boom, and so, there's this booming business of devices, and so we knew these things had all been looted, right? And so, that would be a sort of smaller thing compared to some of the other strategic reasons they had for being in these countries. Rwanda, intervening in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that's covered in here too, that Rwanda is now held up as this post-genocidal society that has had this massive economic development. Okay, well, apart from the repression, but even the economic development, where did they get that money? Well, they looted it from the Congo, right? And how many Congolese died in those conflicts? Well, we're on 5 million and counting of war-related deaths in the Congo. It's not just Rwanda, of course, but again, we don't look at that. Well, you do again, but many Americans don't. So since I'm coming to my 1 hour and want to leave you with lots of time for questions, I just want to give you not conclusions of my Somali case study, but sort of overall conclusions that I draw at the end of the book about the case studies in general, the political and military intervention. 5 general observations. First, African actors are not absolved of all responsibilities for African problems, and as I've mentioned, I refer especially to autocrats and their associates, warlords, violent extremists, and all too often the media just says Africans, right? And we know these people weren't elected by anybody. We say, I think probably most of us in this room, that president there down in Washington, he doesn't really represent how we feel. And yet, we did have a democratic election. Yeah, we had a lot of problems with voter, voter restrictions and voter, disenfranchisement, et cetera. But nonetheless, Americans had some voice in electing this man. Well, in many of these countries, there wasn't even that. Yet, these folks are blamed for their problems. Second, the role of outsiders in stimulating, promoting, and sustaining conflicts in Africa has been critical. Third, religion and ethnicity are not the root causes of African conflicts. While these factors have been involved in many of the conflicts, they generally mask the true source, the underlying structural inequalities that are so prevalent, the poverty and underdevelopment, the lack of opportunity, and the devastating impact of climate change and environmental destruction. And it's just too easy for the media to say tribalism or Christian-Muslim conflicts without looking, well, why are the herders and the farmers fighting? Well, they're fighting over this scarce water, this scarce arable land, and they just happen to be in different economic modes of production, and those modes of production tend to be dominated by different ethnic groups and sometimes different religions, but sometimes the same religion, right? Darfur, they were all Muslims, right? So we can't talk about religious conflict. So how are we going to explain it? Well, then it's ethnic, or tribal, as they would say. Fourth, the solutions are not military, and they will not be quick. They cannot be imposed from above or outside. Solutions imposed from above or outside without regard to local interests will not succeed. We've seen this in Somalia. We've seen this in Egypt. We've seen this in Libya. This means including women, youth, and civil society institutions in the process from the outside and all the way through. And honestly, they can't just be brought in at the end, okay, endorse this and implement it, right? Which is generally how they're brought in, if they're brought in at all. They need to be listened to, their grievances need to be truly addressed. And that's the fifth claim, that these underlying grievances rarely are addressed in the peace accords. And so the problems are left to fester until the new conflict emerges. And again, this can only happen if these groups are brought in, these civil society groups are brought in at the beginning. And I should say that outsiders can't decide which groups are going to be excluded as well. And this especially goes for Islamists in many parts of Africa, where the conflation of violent extremists and Islamists is still huge, and Islamists in Egypt, Islamists in Tunisia have a lot of popular support, the Muslim Brotherhood. And if these groups are excluded or allowed to win and then overthrown with a blind eye turned, or negotiated out of office like happened in Tunisia, and then those who pushed them out get a Nobel Prize, you know, that this is going to be a problem because they're the best organized and they have the greatest support in many countries, and they are players, whether or not we agree with everything they do, and they need to be there. And if they're not there, they're going to say, what's the point? And we see what happened in Algeria when Islamists were not allowed to take power, and groups began to splinter and become violent, and this horrible war in Algeria in the 1990s. You know, we're seeing some of that in the Sinai Peninsula. We're certainly seeing that in Libya. If they left no alternative, yes, they'll join Al-Qaeda, yes, they'll join the Islamic State. Not all, but some. That's another lesson in terms of a peace accord working. And certainly while we want regional brokers, interested parties should not have too much power in these processes. You know, that they're eyeing the water resources and the mineral resources or the energy resources, you know, on the other side of the border, and, you know, trying to figure out how to put people in power that are going to retain that access. So I leave with these kind of lessons learned, and guess what? There is nothing in the conclusion about, and here are the solutions, other than, you know, as a historian, that isn't my job. But really, I guess the main thing is to listen to people on the ground. If we're going to give aid, find those local NGOs that are doing these good things, support them in ways that they want to be supported. Don't think that we know what's best for them and go in there with, you know, with our wares and our wherewithal and try to impose. And I think that's very hard for many Americans to do in our own country as well. So, all right, I thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Betsy. I'm sure there's lots of questions and comments. For those of you who are first-timers at the Eye on Africa, this is not for amplification, but I'll be walking it around. It's so that our colleagues who are participating via live stream, I will watch it once it's totally recorded, can fully hear your questions or comments. So, who would like to be first? Thank you.
Oh, I thought you were going to be first, Nicole.
No. I'm just going to pass the
Bernard, right? No? Bernard?
Yes. I'm Bernie Moore, a PhD student here at MSU in African History. Many of us here TA for classes which are surveys in African history, many of which will deal with similar issues of foreign intervention, both during the Cold War and after the Cold War. Teaching students who have very little understanding of these issues, and you rightfully pointed out that this is a good way to sort of build a background. My question is, with your experience teaching these things, how do you avoid cultivating a sense of pessimism and desperation on the part of the students? Because anger is one thing, because anger can be channeled towards positive uses, but pessimism is much harder to do that. Can you maybe talk about your experience teaching some of these things to students?
That's right. That's a very, very good question. Well, and as I said at the beginning, I emerged from the anti-apartheid movement, and we were going to change the world and all these things, and then you realize, la lucha continua, the struggle continues, that victory is certain, but only for a while, and then the next generation comes and they forget or don't know, and things happen. And so I've taken a longer term and more nuanced view, and just with the understanding that we need to always be vigilant, and that when we look at the state of our society today, I hear people say it's never been this bad. I say, oh yes, it has. Oh, yes, it has. You know, we're not in the time of slavery. We're not in, you know, massive lynching where, you know, horrible things are happening and we have to fight it and we have to, you know, we have to make sure it doesn't happen again. But we've taken steps forward and we've taken steps backward, but it's not all the way back. And that is just the way humanity is. And, you know, as a historian, to try to get them to see the long arc of history and the importance of not losing heart, not giving up. And yes, we can make a difference, a little difference. So Dave and Chris and I were just in Chicago last week at a tribute to an extraordinary man named Prexy Nesbitt, and some of you also may know of him. He was a key person in many movements in the United States, and I am getting to your question. He was a community activist in Chicago. As a young man, he worked with Martin Luther King when King's headquarters, Northern headquarters, was set up in Chicago. He knew Eduardo Mondlane. They went to the same church when Mondlane was a graduate student at Northwestern, and Prexy was an early pioneer of American students to go to Africa. He went to Tanzania in the early 60s. By the time I got to know him, he was a big deal in the anti-apartheid and Southern African Solidarity movement, and he gave me my first job on Africa at the Institute for Policy Studies, and he's the person who said, okay, you need to unmask the Sullivan principles, and those were the fair employment principles that American corporations were adopting to justify their presence in South Africa and to camouflage the strategic support their corporations were playing in bolstering and sustaining the apartheid economy. And so, as I shared at the tribute, it never occurred to me that a 23-year-old with a BA in American history really couldn't tackle this, because Prexy told me I could. And when I first looked at them, I thought, well, what's wrong with these? You know, these look like standard equal employment opportunity principles, fair employment practices, non-discrimination in the workplace, job training and advancement, not understanding the strategic role the corporations were playing with a minuscule number of African workers who'd be affected by this employment code. And so I knew I had to figure out what was wrong, and so I did very quickly. And Prexy took it to this big meeting 3 weeks later, not the book, but its predecessor, a much shorter study, a big meeting of black religious leaders who were meeting to come up with their position on apartheid. And they were going to be addressed by Reverend Leon Sullivan, who conceived of these principles, had been a big activist in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, had a huge Baptist church in Philadelphia, very well respected, and also on the board of General Motors. And he had started his career as a board member of General Motors calling for sanctions and economic withdrawal, and when that got nowhere, he kind of sat back, and the black religious leaders were saying, Leon, you got to do something here, right? And so he came up with the principles. And his ego was behind them, and he had an ego. And so Prexy knew that if there wasn't an alternative, that the religious leaders would support their brother, right, in the struggle. And so my job was to unmask them, and Prexy handed it out, saying, this is the Sullivan information, as people went in, not saying, oh, I'm not with Sullivan, I'm with his critics. And so apparently it made a bit of a brouhaha, and Prexy had ready alternative resolutions to the Sullivan principle. One called for complete economic sanctions and withdrawal, and the other called for the black religious leaders to support the African National Congress in its struggle for freedom in South Africa. And those passed. So here I am, 23 years old, thinking, oh my God, this is what I want to do with my life. And we all got fired from the Institute for Policy Studies right after that, because we were, you know, kind of shaking things up with their funding base, which was, of course, foundations that got money from corporations. And so Prexy went off to the World Council of Churches program to combat racism, got money to give to the Institute to pay for the publication of that book. Not my salary, but the book, which is the one that was later banned in South Africa, and then I went to grad school. And I often think that was probably the most significant thing I ever did, you know, writing that book, because it was used by the divestment movement, the colleges, the universities, the state and local governments. It certainly had a print run that was far greater than any of my academic books. And so that area is not here anymore, but what I've done with my students is I've incorporated service learning into the courses, and Baltimore is a big resettlement area for refugees. And so there are a lot of refugees from other parts of the world, but a lot of refugees from different African countries. And so my students are going and they're working primarily with children and high school age students in after-school tutoring programs, helping them with English language, acculturation, homework help, and for the high school students, college essays, SAT prep. And they come back and they write reflections and they try to link it up to what we're studying, and they say, oh my God, these students have been through so much, and they know, they work so hard, and they just started learning English, and 4 years later, they're the valedictorians of their high school classes. And they all want to be doctors, and they all want to be engineers, and it's, yeah. This is what immigrants do, and you know, their families support them, and they got all these scholarships, and so they're going home to their Thanksgiving dinners and saying to their family who supports other ideas about immigrants, gee, Mom and Dad, you don't understand. Or, you know, Muslims really aren't like that. You know, the children that I work with, ... And so they're feeling like they're making a difference in these smaller groups of people's lives, but oh my God, he passed his algebra test and he got into the University of Maryland. In this case, University of Maryland with a full ride, room, board, and tuition. So-and-so became a Johns Hopkins Baltimore scholar, free tuition to Johns Hopkins, right? Others, you know, have gone to the community colleges and worked their way through there. And, you know, it blows away the minds of my mostly well-off, fairly conservative students. And so just find a way that they can feel like they're making a difference and say, that's okay if it's just that. That's okay if you know, just there's one kid in the tutoring program, you know, where you've bolstered their confidence and their capacity to do something. And I mean, and it's important for all students to feel this. I mean, students of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, right? But I've got to say that, you know, the more students of color we can get involved in these kinds of after-school tutoring programs, the better. The more students who are immigrants themselves or whose parents were, because they really become more tangible role models even than, you know, the white, more privileged, and certainly they're privileged people of color as well, but you know, at my institution they tend to be predominantly white and privileged, and you know, and they can do their share of good. But when there's a student whose parents came here from Rwanda and they're back, you know, volunteering, or in the case, one of my favorite cases, the case of Guinea, where a kid was on Soccer Without Borders, and then he came to Loyola. And he went back and volunteered with Soccer Without Borders with his, you know, the kids who were still there. So, yeah. So that was a long-winded response, but hopefully it encapsulated some of the other issues that might come up as a teacher, of encouraging people that you know, we just have to keep on struggling, and there is progress. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a question about, so you talked a lot about how outside forces have attempted to intervene in Africa. How have those interventions shaped like behaviors of political leaders, civil society, et cetera? Like, how has this actually shaped the way that people... In those countries? Yeah, in those countries.
Okay, great. Well, they certainly cater, as did the dictators during the Cold War. They cater to the fears of the West. They're very good at reading what will sell. And so terrorist threat becomes, you know, the new communist threat, as I've said. And so they will present local insurgencies by people with legitimate grievances as being a terrorist threat. So one of the case studies that I cover would be Mali, and that is a case study that follows up immediately on the case study of intervention in Libya during the aftermath of the Arab Spring to protect civilian lives, when in fact it was really regime change that was the motivation, and without a thought to the fact that Gaddafi had pretty much destroyed all civil society institutions. So guess what's going to happen? You know, when he's gone, you know, all hell is going to break loose. And so the fighters, his trained Tuareg fighters, go back to Mali and Nigeria with the weapons that have not been guarded by the NATO troops in Libya. So the insurgency that began in northern Mali was one that was a Tuareg independence movement, unconnected to any kind of violent extremism related to any kind of religion, but they were bolstered by the Tuaregs from Gaddafi's army, but also by Tuaregs that had been trained in U.S. counterterrorism operations, who quit the Malian army and joined the Tuareg nationalist movement. Parliamentarians from the elected democracy who joined. But then, of course, there was a military coup by an American-trained army captain who was upset that the Bamako-based Malian government wasn't adequately addressing the independence movement, and then Al-Qaeda comes in, right? And so, you know, the U.S. government was pushing Mali, elect a government, elect a government. We can't give aid to you directly until you have a democratically elected government. We are legally constrained from doing that. So we did all this support stuff, you know, around what the French were doing, but not direct aid until there was an election. But again, you know, it's setting the stage for dictators to be in control, because then they can, you know, fight the terrorist threat without, so-called terrorist threat, without concern for the implications for the civilian population, without redressing the grievances underlying it. And, you know, as Dave Wiley has shown in much of his work on the militarization of U.S. foreign policy, resources are shifted from humanitarian endeavors to defense and security, and more of the human security concerns are shifted to Defense Department, where people aren't trained in that area and are looking for different kinds of solution. And the money is coming more and more from those factors. So it's very, very dangerous, you know, to the long term. And you know, we're continuing to support lots of unsavory regimes that turn the weapons against their own people. Yeah. Eric, yeah.
Thanks for the very insightful presentation. I know that in your presentation you mentioned that you're not really considering or taking into account every factor, example, economic intervention and all that. So yeah, I based on that, I just want to ask this question, that beyond the interventions of outside entities, what about things that are happening or taking place within Africa, especially like institutional structures?
Yes, yes.
So I was wondering, like, if you were to include the institutional structures of certain African countries, for instance, Somalia, would it alter your overall 5 conclusions?
Ah, yes. Well, that's definitely a lack in this book, and I do acknowledge that you know, and it's kind of interesting because my Guinea books and my Zimbabwe book are social history. So when I went to grad school, I went from this sort of looking at the sort of corporation, foreign policy, diplomacy kinds of things to the lives of ordinary people. And I loved it, and it was great that I sort of had to do that, you know, based on where I went and who I studied with. And I thought, oh wow, this is so welcome, and I love doing that. And now I've gotten away from that again, and it feels very awkward not to be looking at the lives and the roles and the real power of ordinary people and their organizations. And so I sort of acknowledge that in the book, and that you're not going to find that in this book. And really, I think it's an important series of books maybe that need to be written about the important work that these civil society institutions are doing, or the youth groups, or the women's groups down at the local level, and how important it be that they're involved in developing this vision of the new society, and they're involved in the peace accords and this kind of thing. And some things that come to mind as projects that really are those to be watched for and emulated, or something that a woman who was also involved in the Southern African Solidarity Movement, Carolyn Long, she's been working with this project in Washington, D.C. It's called the Grandmothers Project, and it's in Senegal. And it's acknowledging the very important role that older women have in many African societies in, conveying values to the next generation, especially to girls, but also to boys, and especially the young boys, right, who hear their stories and, the morals and all those kinds of things. And that they can be trained in health kinds of issues and other kinds of things, where sort of like the Chinese barefoot doctor model, and that they will be listened to more than outsiders who come in with these frightening space age outfits, during the Ebola epidemic, right? While those things, I guess, were necessary, it really, in some ways, had a backlash that was really unfortunate. So, yes, those groups have to be looked at and they have to be supported. And maybe when you're done with your dissertation research and this very interesting project you have, that could be your next book. Yeah, to look at this, not all over the continent, because again, but or maybe a survey at some point that has a few case studies from different parts of the continent, looking at what local people are doing that so often get overridden by these outsider initiatives. Like I just talked about the peace initiatives that were on the ground. There was one going on in Libya before Gaddafi was killed that the African Union was very engaged in, and the US and France were just, no, we don't want to have anything to do with it. And there was one going on in Mali, and the French decided to intervene unilaterally. One going on in Somalia, and that's where the US forces dropped a bomb that killed these elders who were negotiating.
Yeah, this is not like a follow-up question. I feel like I want
submission. I think that what you're saying is very interesting. I'm thinking about this, like if we have, or if there existed some form of structures. I remember Dr. Folu mentioned, he is a professor here, mentioned that he conceptualizes Nigeria as a captured state. Like it's a country that has been captured by elite soldiers. And so until those sort of crop of soldiers are out of the system, it will be difficult to restructure stuff.
Yeah.
And so given the example of like Libya, for instance, if Gaddafi is out, how do we reconstruct the state or the country? We can go back to the books or bureaucracies. But because there isn't any strict or structures like that, the power vacuum becomes a little widened and people will try to enter in. So like what you said, I think it will be very interesting if we have foreign entities coming in, local and civil groups also playing their role in relation to existing structures. That would be very, very interesting mix.
We have time for one more question. Aegis, go ahead.
Okay, if there is somebody here, I can take up my question. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.
I quite enjoyed it, and I resonate with so many issues you have growing up in Nigeria and northern Nigeria in particular. My quick question has to do with maybe what you might have seen or encounter in the field or in the book that I am yet to read. Hopefully I get a chance to read it. How do you think these foreign institutions and interventions the capacity of local institutions or organizations to respond to crisis in Africa? And I think a quick example to just make my question clear is the issue of Ebola in West Africa. And Nigeria is one of the regional powers in West Africa. And it takes the order of United Nations and other countries for Nigeria to step in with her people and resources to help fellow West Africans.
That's right.
So to what extent do you think these foreign institutions and interventions are weakening the ability of these regional institutions or national institutions to respond to crisis?
Excellent. Well, it really is a catch-22. And I guess the trick each time is to find the snag, because he who pays the piper calls the tune is one of our old adages, right? And so we see the EU also having a huge role in some countries because they funded the peacekeepers, as French interventions and things like that. And it doesn't mean that no good could be done. It's true, the global North has all these resources that the global South doesn't have, and there's reasons for that. Colonialism, for instance, right? And so it would be foolish of us to say, and wrong of us to say, oh, well, Ebola is your problem, and you figure it out, guys. This whole African solutions to African problems. Yeah, well, who started the problems in the first place? Now that it's out of hand, we say, oh, the Africans need to resolve it. We'll just leave you alone. Well, wait a minute. You've already intervened. Now you've got to clean up the mess. It's like, okay, you left the dirty dishes in the kitchen. I mean, who do you think is going to wash them, So that's my mom's. I do think that outside resources are needed, and I think they're required, and what's tricky is how do we get them to the right people without the constraints that are going to help only interested parties. And certainly dealing with the Ebola crisis did require a lot of outside help. Apparently, from what I've learned, the most useful help was from Cuba. And the Cuban doctors, as they were during the Cold War, have been extraordinary because they have much better knowledge of tropical diseases. They have much better ways of dealing with things without all kinds of high-tech solutions because of the embargo. And they have been also much better about working with local people without having an attitude. So their doctors, they were actually training some of the Western doctors. Well, they're Western too, but you know what I mean. The global North doctors that went in, and they were very, very effective. But even the Ebola crisis, and here I'm diverging from your question, but I think it's important to note, the reason it ravaged Liberia and Sierra Leone so much was because of these wars that are a case study in here, that where the rebels and the government absolutely destroyed the rural health infrastructure. And often that was not at all mentioned in the media portrayals of, oh, Africa is so disease-ridden, and well, why is this out of control? And wait a minute, let's go back and look at who was involved in these wars and what outsiders were involved in, what their interests, and the conflict diamonds, and all of those things that, it's all bound up together. And so when we get the Ebola crisis, we can't just say, oh, well, deal with it.